Welcome to the DataStream podcast, where we talk about ways to leverage data to improve supply chain operations. Today on the show, we have a special guest, Andy McKenzie. Andy is the Director of Supply Chain Operations at King and Prince Seafood. Andy, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Amir. Glad to be with you today.
The pleasure is definitely all ours. You've held operations and supply chain leadership roles for a long time. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. I've certainly been blessed to work in various aspects of supply chain for the bulk of my career, on the entirety of it, essentially. From global sourcing to supplier development, S&OP planning processes, distribution and logistics. And I think that's given me a very comprehensive overview of supply chain activities. And so we're excited to be talking to you about some of these topics today.
I think that basically gives you coverage of the entire domain of supply chain and probably perspective about the entire chain in essence. In the past few years, we've been hearing a lot of voices talking about volatility in the global supply chains. Obviously, starting with the pandemic, but also more recently around the Red Sea and Panama Canal situations. These events are often referred to as once-in-a-lifetime events. Are these disruptions really that unique in your opinion?
I think we certainly have better coverage of them, right? Almost instantaneous. With our media and tools that we have, we simply have much more access to them. So I don't think they're unique. I think we need to learn from them and we have to make adjustments, but clearly they create additional volatility. Certainly not unique.
I think some of our listeners who are of the younger generation maybe aren't familiar with some of the examples from before their time. Are there any memorable events that you can think of that, prior to the 2020 pandemic, which is almost the defining event of our generation, I would say? Can you think of other examples of things that people thought this is a once in a lifetime event?
08, 09 mortgage crisis would probably be the next most memorable for the generation that's currently working. It can be that. It can be as simple as a government mandate regarding no further imports from a certain country. It can be many things that we just have to adjust to on a daily basis. We talk to our people all the time about how do we position ourselves to be successful. And you can only control those controllables. You can simply position yourself to be effective in those times that you can't always control. There are many of those flagship events, if you will, that have occurred over the years, but to me, the 2008, 2009 mortgage crisis might be the next most memorable event because of the extensive waves that occurred throughout the organization.
That's really interesting. I think people are almost accustomed to thinking about the 08-09 financial crisis as a finance industry event. Could you share some examples of how that impacted the global supply chain side of things, the physical market, if you will?
From an organizational perspective, it just affected obviously liquidity, capital, and investments, right? So whether it was suppliers overseas or domestic or transportation between those two entities, it simply made everyone pause. And whether they themselves or the company itself was thriving at that time or perhaps doomed from that particular instance, it just made everybody pause. And so you did an instant jerk back. So whether it was shipments that got delayed, capital that was planned that was no longer being invested, price implications across the board, commodities destroyed, all those types of things just became immediate implications out of that. Very similar to the pandemic. Most people may remember a time when oil was between $0 and $1 a barrel at that time, and it just had crazy things happen for 24 to 48 hours at a time.
To impact the company's supply chain, the events don't even have to be what you called flagship events, right? That's almost the easy example, I think, in conversations and definitely in the news cycle. But realistically, disruptions take a lot of different shapes and forms and definitely sizes. Seemingly small thing that happens almost around the world might have pretty severe impact and make a pretty severe disruption to a company's supply chain.
Absolutely. We deal with those daily, weekly, monthly fluctuations. It is those events that cause people to make those decisions, right? Whether it's supplier pricing or commodity pricing fluctuations that are, instantaneous at that time, but cause ripples for days, months, years ahead.
I think one of the things you've established is one, that volatility is a constant almost, but at the same time, it's also very, very variable. It's fairly safe to say that things will probably always go sideways, but it's very unpredictable how they would go sideways. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it is. We spend a lot of time trying to figure out what those baselines are. When you speak of going sideways from what? Right? And what's it relative to at that time? Do we zoom out to see the entire picture? Has what's relevant changed? Is there a new normal that's been created? When we talk about something going sideways, I think it's important that we always make certain that we understand what's relevant, whether it's commodity pricing or lead times or even something as simple as container vessel pricing. All these types of things are moves that we are responsible to manage and to follow. If we don't understand what's relevant, and I don't necessarily mean history here, but what's relevant at the time, what are those variables that affect it? When you say sideways from what? What are we following? What's relevant and what's relevant today that can affect those things that we quote unquote go sideways on?
So I find that really, really interesting because what I'm hearing you say is that on the one hand, there's a lot of variables and there's a lot of different things that could happen that would impact a company's operation. But it almost sounds like the key is understanding of this whole universe of things that could go wrong and might go wrong. It's imperative to understand how those things impact your operation and to what degree and in what way in order to be able to understand what information to be looking at, what data to be gathering, what to be monitoring at every point in time in order to make any data-driven or any data-based decision or implement any data-driven processes.
It's a big focus for us and has been throughout my career. I've seen it impact organizations and particularly supply chain. You've got these noises out there, right? I was first introduced to this concept with a book called The Signal and the Noise by a guy named Nate Silver. And how do we determine what is really the focus of that data and the signal of that data versus what's noise? And how do we control that? How do we protect our organization from variables that we can't control? But how do we position ourselves to be successful in that environment? It is very much how do we manage that? It's something we spend a lot of time on.
Interestingly enough, I think Nate Silver earned his American, at least, famousness in somewhat predicting election results with a very famous, I think, now website called 538.org.
I just felt like the principles that I saw in that publication and outliers of that are just incredible focus, whether we're talking about election results or supply chain projections or commodity pricing, all those things that we can get into in terms of how data affects decisions and how data integrity, the biasness of that, what are the controlling variables, and just essentially how do we protect ourselves and how do we position ourselves to be successful in those environments that we cannot always control.
You raise a really interesting point. I think a lot of the dynamics that you describe, that you operate by, are principles a lot of other operators would want to follow. Also, a lot of our listeners don't necessarily know when to start when they're thinking about building an organization and building and putting the processes in place that acknowledge volatility being a part of their doing business. And how do they even get started? On the one hand, there's this universe of potential signals you could be looking at. And there's also all these different dimensions within your operation and your processes on how those signals could be impacting your business. And then you need to go and collect the information. And then you need to figure out how to process it and manage it. And you made a really good point about controlling for bias. What can you trust? What can you not trust? How do you make decisions based on data? It might be a very broad question, but where do you start?
Everything we start with is our people and our processes, but how do we build a team that can understand those concepts and can contribute in those areas? So for us, we have spent a lot of time on leadership development in terms of whether it's our floor operations supervisors or our planning teams, our procurement teams, even our people who schedule our docks, those types of processes. It's essential initially that we understand those processes and that secondarily we have teams in place that are focused on those processes. And then within those processes, we train our people on what those data implications are. For procurement, it might be commodity pricing, but for our people who schedule our docks, it can simply be things that are relevant to that process with demurrage and detention data. The thing that links those two together now, the people in the process, is the access to systems today that we never had 20 years ago. We never had those systems. We never had that data. It's always been about people and processes and how we build those teams to manage that. But now linking those to our systems, that's where I think organizations have to take advantage of the new technology and ensure that those systems are in place to help manage our people and manage our processes.
Which is incredible to know, right? How the technology landscape has changed over the last few decades. But at the same time, how do we help the teams that we've built try and make that transition and adopt new technologies? It's not always easy, and change management isn't always easy. People are often they've been trained on certain sets of processes, on certain sets of thinking or doing business and analysis. What can leadership teams do to help their teams both understand the benefit of learning new skills and adopting new tools and new processes, but also understand the benefit that it would provide for the company as a whole?
I think it has to start with education, whether it's our senior leadership team or our floor operations team. I think we have to educate and motivate in a relevant fashion, whether we're convincing the senior leadership team that investments are needed in this area, or whether we're convincing a floor operations team of the benefit of equipment tracking capability that's necessary for productivity type assessments. Those are sometimes scary things for them. It's kind of like Big Brother watching. If we educate them on the benefits of that technology and how we intend to use it, not as a whip or not as a monitoring device, but as a team and organizational efficiency measurement or KPI, then that becomes, I think, much more palatable in the same way that with a senior leadership team, we're encouraging investment on the floor operations side or in our transportation area. If we throw things at people and squeeze it down their throats, we're not going to be successful. We have to educate, we have to organize that momentum, if you will, and gain their input and gain their participation. That's an area that we've had some, I think, benefit in. Whether it's been different platforms or systems, makes us much more successful.
And that makes perfect sense. A lot of our listeners come from the supply chain technology side of the house. How can we, as companies who build software to be used in these situations, how can we, or what can we do to help make the transition and the education better or easier for the companies and the users, and make this entire process better for everyone as a result?
Well, I mean, I think Unity SCM has done that, Amir. Any of the people participating in that process has been excellent in that endeavor. So let me first of all say that. Secondly, just simply being able to make the user interfaces accessible and knowledgeable in the design of it, perhaps in the dashboards and the configurable options, but then also in the training, just simply being aware that the user isn't always part of that initial decision-making process. They aren't always part of the platform choice. They aren't always part of the platform implementation. And it really is not something that I don't think the platform owner can handle, but it does need to be something that you can be aware of and be involved in, I guess. I will say Unity SCM has been fantastic in that area for us, particularly in the container tracking interfaces.
Thank you. We definitely try, and I'm going to take that as a huge compliment. And I'll definitely convey that to the team as well. Obviously, change management is challenging, and working with stakeholders, both at the executive level to communicate the value, but also at the individual contributor level to make sure that adoption is smooth and effective. You've held positions in different parts of the supply chain: logistics, procurement, planning, etc. What are areas that have benefited from new technology and new tools over the last couple of decades? And what are some areas where there's still opportunity to improve, maybe because the processes or the tools are still outdated?
Obviously, I think we made tremendous strides even in the last 18 months with the API interfaces and container tracking. For us, that was absolutely huge. Things like order lifecycle management or the purchase order processing, and those have made tremendous strides. I think from my perspective, the opportunity here is there's no one tying all that together. If we talk about a phrase, order lifecycle management, from a PO issuance to a receipt of the goods in a TMS system. Whether we're talking the PO side with order lifecycle, container tracking side, there are leaders in that industry, and you guys have done a fantastic job with that. And then there are things that on the TMS side where they're different, whether it's the doc appointment scheduling and the document retentions and the load tendering processes. All those things are handled well within those systems. And I think the TMS systems have really come a long way from 5 to 10 years ago. But there's no one out there tying all that together. That, if I could say to the technology world, where is that? How can we tie all of that together? Instead of having a platform for purchase order management and a platform for TMS and a platform for container tracking, how do we not tie all this together? Oh, and by the way, we've got another ERP system. We've got another forecasting and SOP planning process, but those are not unique. They are understood. They are definitive. And so if we have 7 different bolt-on platforms, how can we not tie those together?
No, it's great. To some degree, people used to think the ERP is going to be the be-all, end-all place where everything kind of comes together. Why do you think that hasn't happened?
I think the innovation is not within those organizations, the leaders of those ERP systems. I think some of the smaller ones are being much more innovative. I just think the innovation isn't. And I'm saying that as an outsider, clearly not closely involved within those major platforms. But to me, it's just not been a focus. It's not been a need. Innovation has not occurred totally within those platforms as it has with many of the other bolt-ons. What's your perspective on that, Amir?
I think you're right? And the biggest challenge we've seen in the industry, and it's also the reason why we've started Unity in the first place, is essentially data siloing and information segregation. For me, the interesting thing about supply chain has always been that, as the name suggests, there's a high level of dependency between every link in the chain on every other link doing their work and communicating well, whether it's the supplier communicating statuses and progress on production or an inventory level, and carriers correctly communicating shipment statuses, and yards clearly communicating dock availability, and so on and so forth, and the ability to tie all of these things together. And what we've seen is that there's 2 major subcurrents, if you will, kind of hindering on what you were hoping to see, making that a huge challenge. One is, as you said, there's all these different systems that don't really talk to each other very well or at all. And then the second thing is also almost entirely across segments. The industry has undergone a lot of outsourcing. Shipping has been outsourced to freight forwarders. Distribution, in a lot of cases, got outsourced to third-party logistics providers. There's the supply chains in general, as we've seen in the past few years, are much longer and much more deeply dependent on suppliers across the world for a lot more of the final product. Even assembly, contract manufacturing has become a huge thing. Even order management and supplier management now are getting outsourced to other companies. One of the big challenges is that, at least if all of the systems were within your 4 walls, you could always go to IT and try and get a report out of them. How do you do that when you're not even the direct owner of the information itself? We've really seen these siloing into systems and then siloing it across organizations to be huge detrimental factors to achieving this vision that you so nicely laid out. For Unity, it's always been the end goal to become that platform that enables companies to pull all this information together, make it easy to pull in and possible to tie together and ingest it together and really consume it together, because different people in the organization need different pieces of information, so that it's very easy. Like you said, it's very important that the end user can easily get to the information that they need. And that's doubly true when it's information that doesn't live within necessarily their own system. So let me ask you something that we've also been hearing quite a lot of in recent years, which is the challenge of hiring new people into these roles and operations. And we talk to a lot of people in leadership positions who hire into all functions in the organization. Where is the next generation of supply chain operators going to come from? What kind of skills would they need? Are they different?
I'm not sure the core competency skills required to be successful are any different, but I think it's imperative for us as leaders that we look for those people who are capable. The analytical skills, as an example, the ability to handle change, the ability to handle pressure. Those core competencies haven't changed. I think we have, again, much more access to people through recruiters and the systems that they're using to throw people in the mix. But the core competencies that we are looking for as leaders that can make individuals successful haven't changed. One of the things that we battled, it's not been the most sexiest of industry to work in. You don't have that 18-year-old going home to mom and dad and saying, hey, and I found my new career. I want to work in supply chain. It's rare. People wander into supply chain. Because of things that happened in the pandemic, supply chains have gained much more additional visibility because of the contributions to the bottom line that the teams can have. For me, having gone through a couple of these cycles, it's an opportunity for our leadership teams and our senior management teams to understand the contributions that supply chain can have. And then it's incumbent upon us through our HR efforts, through our recruiting efforts to bring in those high competency level employees with a lot of runway, a lot of opportunity for growth into the supply chain areas and develop them accordingly. If we bring the people in with the right skill sets, we educate them appropriately, train, and we compensate accordingly, then I have no concerns that anybody we bring in a supply chain can have fun, they can enjoy their career and be successful in supply chain. Somebody that's working in warehouse transportation today can easily work in procurement tomorrow if they have the oversight and the training to do so.
We talk a lot about knowledge workers and analytical skills and so on, but when you see the type of work that supply chain operators in the different departments, be it planning or procurement or logistics or warehousing, a lot of the work is highly analytical information analysis. A lot of it is planning and execution and handling exceptions when things don't go according to plan, and evaluating alternatives against KPIs. In general, processes and activities that are highly data-driven. And now with the addition of new tools and new technologies to make it easier to go through these processes, we might end up finding out that the pandemic was not only great PR for how important supply chain is, maybe it even opens up opportunities for people to explore this as the industry of choice. One of the other things, though, that happened during the pandemic is the rise of remote working. I think a lot of people kind of think, oh, supply chains, you're moving physical things, you probably need to be there to do it. How have you seen remote work being adopted in our world?
I think there's certain functions that can be quite successful remotely. It is, to me, the location isn't as important, particularly in a multi-site organization. It isn't the actual location of the employee, but their comprehension and engagement in the actual operation and in the processes involved with that. An employee who previously worked in the warehouse and distribution centers of our organization and understands dock efficiencies and labor efficiencies and all the demurrage and detention, think about how valuable that knowledge could be on the procurement side. And if they're in procurement and they have that knowledge and benefit that affects the entire operation effectively, it doesn't really matter if they're working from home or in the office. I think I just want to put a much more effort and focus on the involvement, comprehension, and understanding of the people and the processes than I would where they physically are.
Oh, absolutely. You definitely had a very diverse career. Is that a common pattern among supply chain operators?
I haven't seen it as much as I would like. I mean, particularly even with our own team, people are much more comfortable in certain areas. And whether it's within a company or within an organization, oftentimes the individual and the organization are hesitant to make those types of moves. I absolutely can encourage everyone to think about the benefit of that, because whether it's a senior manager or a senior leadership team member or floor operations team member, if we can move people within the processes, within their functional areas, and they can have a complete and comprehensive understanding of not only their teams and their involvement, but the others as well, it does nothing but make that individual, their teams, and the organization that much more effective.
And that makes a ton of sense to me because, again, the dependency and the interrelationships between teams that's required to make a supply chain work effectively would really benefit from the teams having more empathy and better understanding of the people they work with in the other building, so to speak, on a daily basis.
I did a stint with my first employer right out of college called the Explorer program at the time. And many organizations still have that type of effort where you have people rotating between not only departments, but functions and sites. And I think that is just just an amazing foundation for success if we can get all of our management team much more highly focused on organizational success versus the departmental contributions.
And perhaps if the tools to be used in every one of the departments are easier to educate and to train on, maybe that will help companies implement programs like that more easily.
Absolutely. I think right now, Amir, they could be hindering it. If our transportation and distribution teams are pretty well focused on TMS systems and awareness and WMS systems and things of that nature, perhaps the procurement teams and the quality and technical teams and our finance teams do not understand. And that's not unique for this company. I think it's true across the board at many organizations I've worked with. There has to be a larger scale understanding of those functions and their involvement in the total process, the whole order to cash lifecycle of an organization and how they can impact it. Back to your whole point about data siloing and departmental siloing very early in our conversation here, it is extremely key, I think, in terms of getting everyone on the same hymn book towards organizational success.
I think you're absolutely right. The key is alignment, not only at the goal level, but also at the method level and the process level, and being able to shift people over the journeys of their career between different seats within the company would be highly, highly effective in achieving that.
Good to great. The book, right? He talks about getting not only the right people on the bus, but we can adjust the people in the seats later. So back to those core competency skills that can allow an individual to be successful, whether they're a controller of an organization financially, or an SOP manager, or a procurement manager, or a warehouse and operations director. Those things all really aren't that different. We silo ourselves, I think, oftentimes with a career, or our company allows us to be siloed in that. But if we can expand upon that foundation, I think the employee benefits as well as the organization. There's a different level of engagement. That gets us back to the whole leadership development thing. Training an employee, a floor operations supervisor, is fairly straightforward and simple. There's certain things that we can teach them, whether it's empathy with our people or our processes or the soft skills and the systems, et cetera. That individual, if they know that they can impact the organization in the future at a different level, at a different position, in a different department, is oftentimes, I think, gratifying and exhilarating for them to have that opportunity and have that vision of what they can be, not just where they're at today.
You really are capturing the win-win of the potential of this, where both the employee benefits, but also the company benefits from employees with a much larger picture or view of how the company works, and they have a much better understanding, which when they'll go, if I go full circles to volatility, when something unexpected happens, they'd be in a much better position to deal with it. Andy, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I'm sure our listeners are walking away with a lot of new insights and ideas on how to improve their own operations, how to train their teams, how to change the way they think about progress and how they think about career progression and how they think about building systems and implementing processes. I definitely walked away with a lot of those. Thank you.
Amir, I certainly enjoyed it.